scientific discoveries, Europe encouraged it more. I mean, you might say, I heard that Europe quelched inquiry. Yes, they did try to stop it, but they didn't. In China, the Chinese philosophers actually stopped their development of Cold War. Again, Europeans had more of a way that a young enterprising person could achieve success. In China, it was nothing but government positions, and if you didn't make it in government, you were looked on as being little or nothing. So there were some differences, a different mindset. Europeans were more inquisitive of how do you put a bunch of gears together to make a pendulum clock. The Chinese mind, we don't care about pendulum clocks. Europeans, again, invented the lenses that eventually made the telescope, the microscope, and eyeglasses. Chinese, all they had to do was curve glass a little bit. Anyway, there were some differences that eventually led to China falling behind. Again, many books have been written on the topic. Folk, morality, I can't say enough about morality, but morality should not be done at the expense of scientific advance. All right, we'll move on. In order to have a novel, you must first have what?
Oh, a printing press.
Printing press. Without a printing press, novels are virtually impossible. Which country invented the novel?
China.
And again, I could ask, and I think hopefully all of you know, which country invented paper money, invented steel, invented porcelain, invented the wheelbarrow. And by the way, speaking of which, folk, we do not, as far as we don't know who invented these things. It's like Europeans honored their inventors. In China, somebody figured out how to mix irons like these mix. Who did it? Now maybe I don't know enough about Chinese history, but I suspect that they did not even document who had done these things. Just somebody along the way invented the wheelbarrow. They didn't care who. Somebody along the way. Well, we do know who invented silk. Some empress discovered silk. But even that person was not really an inventor. It was just some empress, and something else too, more so than the Europeans. The Chinese kept a lot of their inventions super secret, hush hush, we don't talk about that. And some Europeans actually believed that silk grew on a certain tree called a silk tree. And actually it's made from worms called a silkworm. But the Chinese kept this secret for a long time. Europeans were more open about their inventions. As a result, people could come along and improve upon them and make them better. In the case of the Chinese, it was a carefully guarded secret. All right, so much for that. Whatever you do, don't forget the name of the great Mongol conqueror who very, very cruel and killed tens of thousands of persons, but who was it? Conquered? Genghis Khan. Now, by the way, one of the papers I've read had to do with Genghis Khan. I forget now whether it's in this class or not. Let's see. Chinese women were considered what? Subservient to men. And one of the practices that helped make the women even stay subservient was a practice called
Foot binding.
Foot binding. Yeah, it crippled them and helped to guarantee that they would be subservient to men. China also had the practice of killing young girls if they're in time of hardship, in time of famine. Oh yes, the center of life for most Chinese, other than a family, was the what? I mean, not the family as much as most people in China lived around a village. So much of Chinese life centered around the village. And even the emperors would oftentimes not interfere in the internal government of the village. Oh yes, what was the trade route that joined China to the Mediterranean?
Silk Road.
Silk Road. Who is the famous Italian who visited China and came back and wrote a book about it?
Marco Polo.
Marco Polo. And he met which Chinese leader? Kublai Khan. Now, what was the name of the dynasty that was conquered by the Mongolians? There's a dynasty that was in charge, and they were the Songs. The Song dynasty just didn't seem to think that you needed to spend a whole lot of money on armaments and on fighting. Now, there was another empire builder after Genghis Khan who built a big empire that extended from the Black and Caspian Seas all the way, included what is today Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan and Pakistan. Who am I thinking about? Tamerlane, sometimes called Tamer the Lane.
Wait, what did Tamerlane begin?
Tamer, T-A-M-U-R-L-A-N-E. I believe that's right, or sometimes called T-A-M-U-R, Tamer the Lane. Now, he built an empire that extended from the Black Sea and Caspian Sea and included Eastern Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. A huge empire right here. Now, Islam made inroads into India, and they conquered and still hold Afghanistan and Pakistan, and Nepal and Bangladesh. But Islam's advance was stopped, not just by a bunch of bushes and trees, I mean, I've mentioned that, and not just by the fact that the Indian armies began to use horses, but there was something else that made the Islamic armies have to stop to advance to India. Anybody know what it was? The Mongolians. The Mongolians came in and they began to oppose Islam. And when they did, the people, the Hindus, were able to regroup and were able to hold the Islamic people at bay. So Islam got the northern part of India and still have. The rest of India remained primarily Hindu. Now, however, eventually another group of people came in and they did more damage to India than the Islamic people. Who were they?
Britain.
Britain? Yeah. Good. Who was the first Europeans to arrive, though? They didn't conquer. Who were the first Europeans to arrive in India? I mean, by sailing around in Africa. The who? Portuguese. I think I heard somebody say. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to sail around Africa and arrive in India. And shortly after, followed the British. I think I mentioned how that the British once had 13 colonies in North America and they lost them. And yes, Georgia was one of the colonies. So to get some colonies back, Britain went to India and conquered India. And they were to hold India until about 1947. All right, China went through a period of disunity after the fall of the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty gave way to a period of disunity called the Era of the Six Dynasties, when China was not united. What might have caused this period of chaos in China? It's called, folk, climate change. Yeah, climate change probably affected Europe, China, and even as far south as India, and may even have affected the American Indians. It's called cooling down. The cooling down, we know the climate cooled. Now, folk, just today at the United Nations said that the Earth is warming up, and it's caused by man-made dependence on coal and oil and natural gas. And we must do everything we can to stop it. And basically, the United Nations mandate is directed at the United States and Europe to try to get us to cool our use of gasoline and oil, and to convince the world that we're the culprits, we're the bad guys who are destroying life on Earth. You know what I think about it, so I won't comment on it any further. But this is going on right today. All right. What happens to plant life when the Earth warms up?
It flourishes.
It flourishes. What happens to all life when the Earth cools down? It lags. Well, it seems like germ life really has a heyday when everything cools down. The germs multiply and start killing people and animals like crazy. Oh yes. Some Chinese emperors and some Koreans did the same thing, but they would take land from the rich and redistribute this land among the poor. What kind of results always come from this practice?
Land ends up going back to the rich anyway.
Land winds up going back to the rich, and the poor wind up poorer than they were to begin with.
You said in China.
The Chinese did this more than once in their history. Oh yes, the Tang Dynasty did that. Took lands from the rich and redistributed among the poor. And more recently, the communists tried the same thing, called collective farming, where they said nobody owns any property. All this community here, you can farm this, you farm this land, and this community over here, you farm this land. And what was the result? Does anybody know what the result was? 25 million Chinese perished from starvation. I mean, folks, this is documented. This happened in the lifetime of your own grandparents. I mean, just in a lifetime, during the lifetime of my father. That's how recent it was. What was wrong with the collective farms? Everybody tried to spend their own time shirking the work themselves. At the same time, over there and say, he's shirking. Each of them accused the other of shirking. If they'd all been allowed to farm their own plot of land, folks, they'd all gotten up and worked. But when they had to farm a collective farm, everybody did as little as they could, hoping somebody else would take up the slack. The result was they perished from starvation in a big pile. This is well documented. Let's see. When the Mongolians invaded Vietnam, they didn't last there very long. What happened? Anybody remember what I said a few minutes ago? What happened to the Mongolians when they invaded Vietnam?
They were killed.
The Mongolians were quickly driven out by means of guerrilla tactics. The Vietnamese learned how to strike and vanish, strike and vanish. Something they could not have done in an open desert, by the way. But in their type of terrain, they knew, they must have even known how to avoid the venomous snakes. It'd strike and vanish.
I got a chance to go to Vietnam a couple of years after I joined the military, and they took us on a tour of these great battles between America and the Viet Cong. And it was interesting where the slots, they weren't holes to get into the mountains, they were slots. And the Vietnamese people were rather small, and so you're talking about a 10-inch drag, and they would just dive through them and get into the holes. And so you could never, I figured you could never kill somebody like that. They could turn around and shoot, and then absolutely turn around and dive into the ground, and even if you returned fire, you were shooting in dirt.
I've heard stories like that, yeah. Well, the United States could not win.
I don't think anybody could win, unless you blew the mountain up. A couple nuclear bombs, you can fix that problem. But.
And the land of Thailand, there's a city that had been lost and forgotten about for some 300, 400 years. It was abandoned. What's the name of the city I'm talking about? Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat. Sometimes abbreviated just simply Angkor. What is the #1 crop the Chinese grow?
Rice.
Rice. Vietnamese also grow rice. The Japanese also grow rice, and I believe the Koreans might also. All right. Oh yes, between the Hindus and the Muslims, which one of them eats beef?
The Muslim.
The Muslims. Hindus do not.
Which one of them eats pork?
But which one? I know the answer, but I didn't want. Yeah. Who knows? Which one of them eats pork? Neither one of them. Hindus nor Muslims. But